So, Jonathan, you're up first. You have 3 minutes to do an introductory statement.
Thank you. Well, I'm here to defend the official theory of 9/11, which is that the 9/11 attacks and the damage they caused were the work of al-Qaeda terrorists who hijacked commercial airliners and smashed them into the Twin Towers and Pentagon. In making the case, I will emphasize the conclusions of others, namely the 9/11 Commission report, the detailed reports from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and journalistic investigations too numerous to mention. All of these reputable sources, I will argue, which collectively draw on the work of thousands of scientists and engineers in government, academia, and private practice, all support the official view of 9/11. In particular, they support the view that the destruction of the Twin Towers, which in my experience is the main obsession of many conspiracy theorists, was caused by the crash of airliners into the upper floors, the ignition of dozens of tons of airplane fuel, the weakening of load-bearing steel columns due to fire, the deformation of critical floor trusses, and the consequent catastrophic collapse of the structures. Members of the 9/11 Truth Movement, as it is called, say they are open-minded skeptics who are simply asking questions. But in the years I spent writing my recently published book about 9/11 conspiracy theories, I found that almost all of these activists have already made up their mind. In particular, they believe that World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7 were brought down through controlled internal demolition, and that the masterminds of this demolition plot were elements within the Bush administration seeking a pretext to attack Iraq and Afghanistan. This conspiracy theory has been debunked many times over during the last decade, but 9/11 truthers still cling to various talking points, which generally consist of misleading scientific factoids and stray quotations from public figures taken out of context. And I imagine that during this debate we will set about discussing some of these details. But one does not have to debate these fine points to understand how far-fetched the conspiracy theorists' views truly are. All one has to do is ask the following question: do you really think it is possible that a secret army consisting of thousands of spies and demolitions engineers could really spend months planting thousands of bombs around some of the busiest office buildings in the world without someone noticing? And even if they were successful in this Hollywood-style plot, do you really imagine that no one from this army of thousands of evildoers would come forward to tell the truth despite the passage of a full decade? Now, conspiracy theorists claim the mainstream media won't tell the truth about 9/11 because we are on orders not to from our corporate puppet masters. But in fact, just about every journalist I know, including me, would love nothing more than to become rich and famous by unmasking a conspiracy that, if true, would be the story of the century. But in fact, these conspiracy theories are not true. And I very much thank the organizers of this debate for giving me the chance to explain why. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Next we have Todd Fletcher. Todd?
The subject of the debate today is the veracity of the 9/11 Commission report, and so we are today supposed to be talking about the 9/11 Commission report's version of the events. Kevin Ryan and I will be addressing the reasons for which we doubt the veracity of the 9/11 Commission report. I'd like to just say a few general things about the report. There are two major reasons to doubt its veracity. One is conflicts of interest in the personnel who ran the commission, and the other is that the report contains lies, implicit and explicit lies, lies of either omission or distortion. The principal and controlling conflict of interest was the close association of the executive director of the commission, Philip Zelikow, with the White House. He was a two-time Bush administration insider. He worked on George H.W. Bush's National Security Council with Condoleezza Rice. He co-wrote a book with Rice during the Clinton years when they were out of office. Rice brought him onto the National Security Council transition team when there was the transition from Clinton to George W. Bush, and then George W. Bush named him to the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. In 2002, Rice picked him to write the 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States, which, for the first time in history, asserted as official U.S. policy preemptive war, subsequently known as the Bush Doctrine, when it was invoked to justify the illegal invasion of Iraq. Zelikow based his argument for the doctrine of preemptive war on the 9/11 attacks. They were the pretext he used for this massive change in U.S. policy to justify wars of aggression. As has been described in New York Times reporter Philip Shannon's book, The Commission, Zelikow controlled the commission virtually completely. He wrote an outline of the entire report, complete with chapter headings, subheadings, and sub-subheadings, before the investigation even began. He kept the existence of his outline a secret with the collusion of Commission Chair Thomas Kane and Vice Chair Lee Hamilton. The staff of the Commission did not find out about the outline until a year later, and some members of the staff compared the Commission report to the Warren Commission report on the JFK assassination, that famous cover-up, as a result. Finally, Zelikow rewrote all drafts submitted by the research teams. The report Zelikow produced contains many lies of omission, implicit lies, of important facts relevant to a full understanding of the 9/11 attacks. The only sense in which the report is a full account, as it was mandated to be,
15 seconds.
Is that it included everything that supported the official conspiracy theory. The attacks were a surprise carried out by al-Qaeda. But almost all facts which suggest otherwise were either omitted or distorted by the report. Kevin and I will provide many examples in the next hour's debate.
Okay, Brian Bonner, you are up next for 3 minutes.
Oh, thank you. Well, I do agree with what Mr. Kay has said. In addition to that, we will be able to look at the scientific aspects of this. What were the possibilities that the claims of the 9/11 report are true? Why are people making claims otherwise? What are these claims, and how can we assess them to see what's actually going on? As has been stated previously, we're looking at people who are claiming to be, quote, open-minded skeptics. Well, anybody that has deluded themselves to the point that they won't listen to anything else has actually branched over and become a cynic. And at that point, we really need to look at the psychology at the people that are making these claims. Why do they believe this? And why can they relate it back to other conspiracies? Because of this is just another belief in the line of conspiracies that they can add on and make an even bigger issue out of something.
Brian,
that...
I'm going to have to ask you to stay on topic.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Well, and like I say, we can look at this and we can go through the scientific data. We can see why the towers collapsed. We can look and see why did Building 7 collapse, but not the way that people are claiming that it did in the Truther movement. And all of these other types of claims we can look at in a very scientific manner to be able to break down and figure out what did happen, and finally come to the conclusion that the report was accurate.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Next, we have Todd Fletcher for a rebuttal. Todd?
Yes, well, in assessing the veracity of the 9/11 Commission report, which is what we're trying to do, it's necessary to talk about the report specifically, and I think that I may as well just in this minute, since the previous speaker did not really talk about the report, I'll just outline an example of a lie of omission from the report. The facts came out after 9/11 that some of the alleged hijackers were still alive. No mention of this was contained in the 9/11 Commission report. The BBC showed that Walid al-Shari was in Morocco. He spoke at the U.S. Embassy a couple of weeks after 9/11. This is a man whose picture was produced by the FBI. He was one of the hijackers. The Commission contained no information on this BBC report that this man was still alive.
Okay, up next is Kevin Ryan for 3 minutes.
Yeah, thanks. September 11th is a sacred day for a lot of us in the United States, and it's a day to honor the victims of 9/11 and also the victims of the resulting 9/11 wars. And many of us believe that the best way to honor them would include reminding ourselves that we really don't know what happened even 10 years later. As Todd said, the 9/11 Commission report is transparently false, and this can be seen in a number of ways. To begin with, the stated goal, as Todd said, of the 9/11 Commission was to provide the fullest possible account of the events surrounding 9/11. But it fell far short of that, and it left out many of the most important parts of the evidence. Really, the number of important facts omitted from the 9/11 Commission report is astounding. But also the 9/11 Commission claimed to have performed, quote, exacting investigative work, but there's little evidence of that. In fact, there's revealing evidence that the 9/11 Commission report is an example of the worst kind of uncritical acceptance of predetermined political narratives. Todd mentioned Executive Director Philip Zelikow, who had prepared an entire outline of the 9/11 Commission report before the investigation ever began. He did this secretly with a colleague named Ernest May, and the detail of the outline included chapter headings and subheadings and even sub-subheadings before the investigation even began. So Zelikow got the agreement of the 9/11 Commission Chairman Kane and Hamilton to keep this outline secret from the 9/11 Commission staff. But additionally, much of the evidence given in the 9/11 Commission report implicating those accused was based on this secondhand information taken from torture testimony. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, for example, whom the 9/11 Commission calls the principal architect of the 9/11 attacks, or sometimes the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, was this torture victim, and he was apparently waterboarded 183 times. And several chapters of the 9/11 Commission report are largely based on this torture testimony, which the CIA recorded, although the CIA never told the 9/11 Commission about these tapes when they asked for them. The really terrible part that adds insult to injury is that these tapes were apparently destroyed by the CIA a few years later. So, what we have is that the remainder of the 9/11 Commission report is based on CIA cables and emails and memos from the National Security Council. So the official explanation for 9/11 as given by the 9/11 Commission report was uncritically built on a predetermined outline that was fleshed out with CIA memos and secret torture tapes that have since been destroyed by the CIA. And that's not an exacting investigation, and it can't be verified. Also, people often mistake the 9/11 Commission for a unanimous bipartisan effort, but it was not. Senator Max Cleland, for example...
We're going to have to stop, Kevin. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Jonathan Kay. Jonathan?
1 minute.
Hi. Well, I'm really glad my opponents made the Walid al-Shari reference, the idea that this 9/11 hijacker is still alive. It's exactly the kind of spurious argument that's made. It is true that on September 23rd, 2001, BBC News reported that Walid al-Shari was alive and well. Within a few hours, they corrected the report and said a man called Walid al-Shari. It was another man with the same name, but by that time, 9/11 conspiracy theorists have jumped all over it, and despite the fact it was debunked 10 years ago, they still parrot it on radio shows. I should also say, in terms of KSM being tortured, it's true. I agree. I think it's a scandal that he was tortured like that, and I can see the point that evidence isn't as good as it could be. In terms of Zelikow editing the report, look, I'm a professional editor. I collaborate with people. I often prepare outlines for them. It's helpful to them. It doesn't mean that I'm preordaining the material for the report. It just means that I'm helping them create a structure. There's nothing conspiratorial about that.
Okay, we're going to move into 5-minute presentations. Kevin Ryan is up first for 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Jonathan Kay mentioned the hijackers that were reported by mainstream news to have been still alive, and I didn't mention that. Maybe Todd did, but since Mr. Kay mentioned it, I think the important point here is not the question of whether they really are still alive. The question is, why was that not investigated? But I'd like to get back to the point that Senator Max Cleland left the commission saying this was a scam. Here, these are his exact words. Senator Cleland, when he quit the commission, he said, quote, "This is a scam. It's disgusting. America is being cheated." He said, as each day goes by, we learn that this government knew a whole lot more about these terrorists before September 11th than it has ever admitted. So he was really disgusted. He quit the commission. But, the 9/11 Commission would never have existed if it were not for the 9/11 victims' family members who got media attention and insisted on an investigation. These family members provided a lot of questions that needed answering. They actually drove the investigation in large part. But the 9/11 Commission report did not address most of those questions. In fact, over 70% of the questions went unanswered. And as I indicated before, the report is not based on exacting investigation. Another example of this is the way in which the 9/11 Commission handled the idea of insider trading related to 9/11. What the Commission did was uncritically accept statements from the FBI that were obviously not supported by evidence. The Commission concluded that what they'd called the, quote, exhaustive investigations by the FBI uncovered no evidence for insider trading, but the truth was that someone did profit through securities transactions. But the Commission, based on the Commission's assumptions of guilt, those who profited had no conceivable ties to Al-Qaeda, in their opinion, and therefore it was not insider trading. This is the kind of example of the logic we see in the official reports. The FBI did not even interview the insider trading suspects and did not try to make any kind of determination if any of the people being investigated might have had ties to Al-Qaeda. The Commission simply accepted unsupported assumptions made by the FBI. And the people who were involved and accused by the SEC of suspicious trades are in fact known to have significant circumstantial links to Al-Qaeda that need to be investigated. So, other than that, the 9/11 Commission report left out or glossed over most of the important information and includes the testimony of Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta, who said that Dick Cheney basically was tracking Flight 77 before it impacted the Pentagon, and that Cheney had issued some sort of orders about that. It completely excluded the testimony to the Commission of World Trade Center hero and janitor William Rodriguez, who said there were explosions in the building. This was corroborated by 14 of his co-workers. The 9/11 Commission report did not make any mention at all of Building 7, the third skyscraper that fell at 5:20 in the afternoon after no plane hit it. And they also excluded the testimony of FBI whistleblower Sibel Edmonds, who said that Osama bin Laden was working with the U.S. up to the day of 9/11. She said that the U.S. maintained, quote, intimate relations with bin Laden and the Taliban, quote, all the way up to the day of September 11th. These intimate relations included using bin Laden and Al-Qaeda for operations in Central Asia in the same way that we did during the Afghan and Soviet conflict. That is, fighting enemies via proxies. So Al-Qaeda is used as a proxy, and according to Sibel Edmonds, right up to the day of 9/11, Osama bin Laden was part of this. So, the 9/11 Commission report obviously did not provide the fullest possible accounting. They didn't even report a lot of the information that was given to them directly. They omitted it, and they did not perform anything close to exacting investigation, as I think I've pointed out in several ways. So the 9/11 Commission report is false simply due to the fact that they did not meet their objectives, and some of the simple things we wanted answered, like why did the air defenses fail, we were given multiple false stories. The first thing we were told right away was that no jets were scrambled to intercept the planes. But that's standard protocol, and that's what NORAD said. So NORAD told this to the country. No plane, and then we got two other stories after that which conflicted with that. So it gets a little bit ridiculous after a while.
Okay, for a 1-minute rebuttal, we'll go to Brian Bonner.
Okay, well, let's take a look at a couple of the different issues that he was talking about there. First of all, he was saying that there was uncritically looked at information on the insider trading. Well, at any other time this would happen, that isn't something that would be noticed or even cared about. So I think we're looking at a little bit of possibly some confirmation bias there. But I'm going to go over to Building 7. The report was that there were explosions after the planes had already crashed. And this was in the other buildings as well. The thing is, with the amount of accelerants within the building, with the amount of jet fuel that was already pouring into the building,
15 seconds.
Explosions throughout the building are something that would be expected, and if they weren't, definitely would be a question of what happened.
Okay, up next is Jonathan Kay for 5 minutes.
Oh, hi. Well, thanks for that. We've been talking about the 9/11 Commission report, and it sounds like my opponents in this debate have have problems with the people who wrote it and what was excluded or included.
Jonathan, please stick to the point, okay?
Sure. Which is the 9/11 Commission report.
Okay.
My view to those, in regard to those who expressed doubt about the contents of the 9/11 Commission report, the first question you should ask is, does it agree or disagree with other reputable sources? If you don't like Philip Zelikow, fine. Look at the report from the National Institute of Science and Technology about how World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7 fell. Look to Lawrence Wright's book, A Looming Tower. Look to all the major journalistic investigations of 9/11 and try to find some detail within the 9/11 Commission report that doesn't square with reality as we know it, as it's been reported from other sources. And you'll find that there is no point on which the leading sources disagree. In terms of insider trading, that was investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. There was no significant blip in trading on American Airlines or other stocks in the lead up to 9/11. In terms of Dick Cheney tracking Flight 77, that's simply not true at all. In fact, up to the point that Flight 77 was destroyed, no one quite knew where it was. And they continued not to know where it was even for 10 or 20 minutes thereafter. Such was the confusion at NORAD. In terms of Rodriguez, who was a janitor in the Twin Towers, and the explosions he reported, Rodriguez himself has come forward and has expressed concern about his eyewitness testimonials being misused by conspiracy theorists. And I should also acknowledge that there are grains of truth to what's being said. It is true that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan did indirectly work with the United States during the Soviet era in the 1980s. When people say that, that is completely accurate. But as the 9/11 Commission report concluded, that cooperation ended fairly abruptly after the Soviet period. The people who claim otherwise are confined to individuals such as Sibel Edmonds. Sibel Edmonds is indeed a real person who exists, a Turkish-American former FBI translator. She has made a number of astounding claims, which are reported on her website. Just one of them, a few of them relate to 9/11. Others relate to nuclear proliferation and that sort of thing. I think they lack credibility. In any case, they've been investigated by all sorts of U.S. committees. She's a professional litigant, and she's tried to bring this to light through all sorts of means. But people can go on her website and decide if they're credible. I don't think they are. In terms of claims about NORAD, it's completely true that NORAD didn't do its job. And some of the claims that were made before the 9/11 Commission were misleading. The 9/11 Commission itself acknowledged that. In fact, the 9/11 Commission referred materials to NORAD's own Inspector General and made that fact public in the 9/11 Commission report. So I don't know what complaints there could be in that regard. In general, I should say that the 9/11 Commission report was prepared by a group of well-known public citizens. Philip Zelikow, of course, is the most notable. And there is a grain of truth to the idea that these people have some conflict and that they have a history in government. And this is the claim that is made in regard to any high-profile commission. It's what's made in regard to the Warren Commission, saying, these are famous people with influential friends, and of course they're compromised. But in a society such as America's, there's no other choice than to use well-connected, famous, highly accomplished citizens for this sort of thing. The only other alternative is to use anonymous citizens who lack any kind of expertise in government. And if they did that, then you wouldn't get a report that people would find credible to begin with. So I do give some sympathy to conspiracy theorists who will say, but this person's second cousin was involved in this commission, or they wrote a report with this person or that or the other. It's true. I mean, these people have some connections to the powers that be in Washington, but that's generally unavoidable in the creation of any kind of commission of inquiry or investigation in any advanced Western nation. It happens here in Canada, where I'm speaking.
All right, thank you. Let's go to Todd Fletcher for a 1-minute rebuttal.
Well, I think it's clear that the conflict of interest of Philip Zelikow is well above the norm that Mr. K was describing. The 9/11 attacks were the pretext for the launching of a global war on terror, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. And Zelikow, before he became executive director of the commission, was the man who authored the NSS 2002, the document which established preemptive war, the U.S.'s assertion of its right to invade a country even if it has not yet been attacked, and there's no clear demonstrable threat of an attack. The point that Mr. K made about the Commission report confirming
15 seconds.
other government reports, well, the NIST reports on the buildings have been shown to have been fraudulent, and of course NIST was an agency of the Commerce Department with the same task as the Commission, which was to cover up the crimes of government officials.
Okay, and I'm Peter Phillips from Project Censor to KPFA Radio. We're part of the Footprint on America 10 years after National Pacifica broadcast. Today we're doing a dialogue on the debate on the veracity of the 9/11 Commission report with Todd Fletcher, who's a researcher with David Ray Griffin, Kevin Ryan, a chemist who's with the Journal of 9/11 Studies, Jonathan Kay, managing editor of the Canadian National Post newspaper, and Brian Bonner, who's with Warning Radio. Next, we have a 5-minute statement from Brian.
Well, I'd like to kind of go back over some of the things that we've talked about here. One of the claims that we're looking at is that victims' family members have come forward in saying that most of the questions have not been addressed. While obviously some family members will have that feeling because this was a very impactful thing on their lives, it's not necessarily always the truth. Most of the families that you talk to, most of the people that have dealt with this, the vast majority of them, feel that they have had more than enough questions answered, and not just that, but been able to witness it themselves through every form of media possible. And at some point we have to look at this and wonder, how much damage is it causing these families to have this sort of thing rerun over and over again, claiming that what happened didn't. But we can go on to this next issue of the claim that bin Laden worked with us, quote, until that day. Well, that is a big question, but at the same time, what is the best way to attack somebody and go unnoticed? To work with them, to stay close to your enemy. That's one of the biggest things in the way of war to do. So, that's just a standard operating procedure. Now, one of the big ones that really concerns me is the quote of 9/11 being a pretext to war. If 9/11 was so important to, depending on what you look, the gold, the oil, the drugs, whatever it is that we were going to war for, why would they do something that, even in foresight, they would have known would pretty much destroy the U.S. economy? Wouldn't you want to do something that would be just as impactful, but not as economically impactful? You'd be able to fund the war that you want much better if the country actually had enough money to support it. And we're seeing that right now, where funding is getting so low that we can't fund this type of a war. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, in the claims that, once again, the reports on how the buildings had been demolished have been, quote, lied about, that's definitely a personal question. There isn't anything in black and white that says absolutely somebody has lied about this. In fact, most of the above-the-board things that you'll listen to, that people have written reports, the government submitted reports, witnesses, victims, all have come forward and said, this is what happened when the buildings went down. This is what happened when the planes hit the buildings. And we have witnesses of planes hitting the buildings. We have witnesses of how things came down. So these claims are something that really needs to be broken down and looked at much closer. And I think an open mind is really important, because we are having issues here right now where nobody's really being able to listen to the other side. So I think that's a really important thing that we need to be able to do.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm sorry. Thank you, Brian. And we'll go to Kevin now for 1 minute. rebuttal. Kevin?
Yeah, thank you. Brian mentioned that he felt that the 9/11 family members' questions had all been answered, but of course I was talking about the Jersey girls primarily, who actually were the ones who drove the creation of the 9/11 Commission. It was the 9/11 victims' families that made that happen, or we wouldn't have had an investigation. They provided the questions. 70% went unanswered. Brian mentioned World Trade Center Building 7, but unfortunately the 9/11 Commission did not mention Building 7 at all. It's nowhere in the report. We wouldn't have even learned about Building 7 if we had just left the 9/11 Commission report to tell us what happened. With regard to the towers, the 9/11 Commission report talked about the pancake collapse, and of course my former company disproved that in 2004. So those questions aren't answered at all.
Okay, up next is Todd Fletcher for the 5-minute presentation.
Okay, I'd like to give some further examples of the tremendous skew that was given on the evidence available by the Commission report. And I'd like to talk about how the Commission changed the story about the activities of key officials in the government and of agencies. For example, the Commission report has a long narrative seeking to establish that Dick Cheney reached the Presidential Emergency Operating Center in the basement of the White House at, it claimed, 9:58. And that he did not reach the P.E.E., as it's called, until after the Pentagon had been struck. That he learned about the striking of the Pentagon while he was in the corridor outside the P.E.E. But this directly contradicts the account given by Cheney himself 5 days after 9/11. He was on Meet the Press with Tim Russert at Camp David, and he described how he was whisked out of his office, down into the corridor, placed a call to President Bush in Florida, and then entered the P.E.E., and he said that he got there shortly after, around 9:15, 9:10, 9:15, something like that. This was confirmed by numerous news stories in the press at the time. None of it, this first account by Dick Cheney was never mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report. They came up with a claim for Cheney's entry into the P.E.E. that was a good half an hour later or more than what Cheney himself said, and then the news story said. Furthermore, the account, Cheney's original account, was confirmed by Norman Mineta in testimony given to the Commission, which Kevin has already mentioned. Norman Mineta reached the P.E.E. around 9:20, and when he got there, Dick Cheney was already there. And then Norman Mineta, his testimony was extremely important, but it was not included in the Commission report. Norman Mineta described that Cheney was watching everyone in the P.E.E. was watching a plane approaching on radar, approaching Washington, D.C., and a staff member repeatedly was telling Cheney about the plane's progress. He says, it's 50 miles out. Then he came up again, said it's 30 miles out. Then he came up finally and said it's 10 miles out, and he said, does the order still stand? And Cheney angrily responded, yes, of course the order still stands. Did I ever say anything to the contrary? Now, Norman Mineta, in presenting this testimony, assumed that this was some kind of an order he didn't understand that this was an order, must have been given to shoot down the plane. He thought it was an order not to shoot down the plane. But this is a highly suspicious testimony given by Norman Mineta, which has been expunged by the report. Furthermore, the same kind of treatment was given by the report to the movements of Donald Rumsfeld and General Richard Myers. The report claimed that these two people were not present in the video teleconferencing conference run by counterterrorism czar Richard Clark, but Richard Clark, in his book that had already been published at the time that the report was before the report was published, said that both of these officers were in the teleconference that he was controlling from the White House, and that they had full information about the approach of a plane toward the Pentagon. In other words, the Commission was omitting fully public evidence. This book by Richard Clark was a bestseller. thousands of people across the country knew that Rumsfeld and Myers were in this video teleconference long before the Pentagon was struck. But the Commission presents a completely false story, not backed up by any solid evidence, that these guys, that Myers was where he said he was, which was some congressman's office, and that Rumsfeld was in his own office being debriefed by a CIA officer or something, and didn't know that the Pentagon had been struck until it was actually hit. So there's a very extreme bias that's been put onto the evidence by the 9/11 Commission report, and these are just examples, and I have many more examples. The Commission report attempted to suggest that the FAA did not contact NORAD in time to bring about a proper air response, but that's entirely false and is unsupported by the news stories that contradict it.
Thank you, Todd. Up next is Jonathan Kay with a 1-minute rebuttal. Jonathan?
Well, most of what we just heard was about people misremembering things. Welcome to the world of faulty recollection. This is something that every litigator in the United States knows. As witness testimonials tend to be unreliable because people don't remember things. I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast today. It happens all the time. People say they were in room A, or they were in room B, or they were there at 10 or 10:10. It doesn't mean that the people involved were conspiring to kill 3,000 people in the World Trade Center. In terms of victims and what they claim, my experience in writing my book is that people who have been victimized by a tragedy often will cling to conspiracy theories the longest. For instance, parents whose children have suffered from autism often are the ones who cling to the debunked theory that vaccines cause autism.
15 seconds.
It doesn't mean that these people are right simply because they cling to these theories the longest. It just means that they have the greatest emotional investment in those conspiracy theories, which is what is the case now.
Kevin Ryan, you're up for 3 minutes.
Yeah, I think it's important for everyone to realize how many false stories we've been given in terms of supporting the 9/11 wars and the idea that the poor people who happen to live on the most strategically important lands just happen to be the terrorists. We've received 3 completely distinct explanations for what happened with the air defense failures. As I said, the first one was that no planes were scrambled, but no jet fighters were scrambled. But that's standard protocol. Whenever we lose contact with a plane or if it goes off course, it's standard protocol that jet fighters are scrambled. And that happened 129 times in the year 2000. So, in that first week when we were told that, people didn't believe it. So they gave us a different story, which was that the jets were scrambled, but they were only traveling at a small fraction of their maximum speed. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense either, of course, but even at that, they should have still intercepted the 4 hijacked planes. So finally, we got a third version that went into the 9/11 Commission report, which was that the jet fighters were scrambled, they were traveling at a fraction of their maximum speed, and they were going in the wrong direction. Now, that's the kind of thing that really only a very gullible person would accept without saying, are you sure this is your final answer? And it's the same sort of thing with the World Trade Center, but going back to the air defenses, some of the questions that I have to do with, like, this very important person was the FAA's hijack coordinator. FAA failed completely according to the official story, and really there should be some questioning. This guy's name was General Michael Canavan. He had been the commander of the Joint Special Operations Command prior to becoming the FAA's hijack coordinator, and along with a lot of other people, he just happened to be missing for the morning hours or for the day of 9/11. I mean, we're talking about George Bush, who was the president was reading My Pet Goat in the elementary school, and I think a lot of us have seen the video of him sitting there for nearly 10 minutes when the country was under attack, and we all knew the country was under attack at that time. Donald Rumsfeld, who couldn't be found for at least 30 minutes. Richard Myers, Montague Winfield, they all found something else to do during the actual attacks. And, that failure of chain of command has never been answered. In fact, most of the people have been promoted or rewarded for it. But additionally, the World Trade Center, we've been given many different false stories. The pancake collapse was in the 9/11 Commission report. That didn't work out. The diesel fuel fires for World Trade Center Building 7 didn't work out. The damage from falling North Tower didn't work out. So people really need to be gullible, or need to be asking questions unless they are really gullible. Is this the final answer on the official explanation?
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Let's go to Brian Bonner for 1 minute.
Okay, well, let's take a look at a couple of things here. First of all, one of these things that they're really having an issue with is the times that Cheney was told about events or where he may have been at the time. Anybody that's ever been a first responder realizes that in times of stress, the first thing that happens is people start getting their stories conflicted. And especially if he was asked 5 days after the fact, human memory isn't the greatest thing in the world. So on that same issue, they're saying that the FAA did not contact NORAD in the appropriate time. Well, that goes along with this as well. Things were hectic. They weren't prepared to do this sort of a thing.
15 seconds.
Even on site, the police and the fire department were having communications issues. So this was not a conspiracy. It was just a breakdown in standard communications.
Okay, Jonathan K., 3 minutes.
Sure. I think Kevin listed a lot of aspects of the official theory. He says, oh, this didn't work out, that didn't work out. Actually, they've worked out quite well. The only people who think they don't work out is the small but dedicated group of people who have made 9/11 conspiracies in their life. So you can't just list off a number of well-proven propositions about the 9/11 attacks and say they didn't work out. Kevin focused on NORAD and said, oh, it was a standard practice to scramble planes to respond to non-responsive aircraft over American airspace. Actually, it wasn't. The only successful interception of a non-responsive aircraft over U.S. airspace between 1989 and 2011 was when Golfer Payne Stewart's airplane was non-responsive in 1999, and it took the American Air Force about an hour to get to him, despite the fact that the transponder on his aircraft was activated, and the transponder on all 4 hijacked aircraft in 9/11 were not there. The NORAD had no idea where they were. In terms of the planes at Otis Air Force Base and Langley Air Force Base, they followed standard operating procedure, which in the case of Otis was to send their planes out over Long Island Sound. In the case of Langley, it was set to send their 2 F-16s out over the Atlantic Ocean. These were Cold War era protocols. Critics are quite right to say that the United States wasn't prepared for 9/11, but the scandal wasn't that it was some kind of conspiracy to wage war. The scandal was that they hadn't updated their military protocols in 2 decades. In terms of the idea that all this was a pretext to take over strategically important lands, I would argue that Afghanistan in 2001 was regarded as one of the most unstrategic places on Earth. As soon as the Soviet Union went kaput, the Americans got out of Afghanistan incredibly quickly, and no one had any interest in going back in there.
Jonathan, I just want to remind you to stay on topic.
Sure. Well, the topic is the, quote, strategically important lands, which Kevin used. They were not regarded as strategically important. And this is my larger problem with alternative views of 9/11, which is that if you really wanted a pretext to wage imperialistic war in the most strategic places on Earth, and you wanted to, really go for the oil, why would you not put Iraqi terrorists on board? This is the part that's never made any sense. You meticulously put bombs all over the World Trade Center, you attack the Pentagon, the whole thing goes off, and yet the 19 hijackers consist of people from countries you don't invade. I've never understood that. The final thing I don't understand is Obama. Okay, Obama comes into office in 2009. He becomes privy to all these government secrets about how they supposedly bombed the World Trade Center and attacked the Pentagon. He has this information which could destroy the Republican Party for a generation, and yet he does nothing with this information. And yet the official story, which I'm here to defend, is completely unchallenged by credible sources. How do they explain how Barack Obama and his administration have not unmasked this giant Hollywood-style conspiracy that we're hearing so much about on this show?
All right, thanks, Jonathan. Up next is Todd for 1 minute.
Well, since I just have 1 minute, I'll respond to the claim that that Afghanistan is not a strategic objective. There's a complete omission in the commission report of the reasons why the United States wanted to invade Afghanistan before 9/11. And the fact that threats were made to the Taliban leadership by American officials that if they continued to refuse to agree to the construction of a pipeline by the Unocal Corporation that the country would be invaded by the United States by October. And these threats were made to the Taliban in June and July, and sure enough, the United States invaded in October.
Okay, we're into concluding remarks right now. We have just a few minutes left in this broadcast. Each side will get 2 minutes. Jonathan and Brian, you are to start.
I'm sorry, who's speaking first?
Go ahead.
Is this me speaking?
Yes.
Sure.
Sure. I mean, I guess I would just respond to what happened in terms of Afghanistan. If the objective of the 9/11 attacks was to build a pipeline in Afghanistan, where's the pipeline? You kill thousands of people. You create the greatest terrorist attack in the history of Western nations. You mobilize hundreds of thousands of American soldiers to fly halfway around the world. You endanger the future of the Republican Party with this gigantic Hollywood-style conspiracy implicating Cheney, Rumsfeld, Bush, and everyone. And then you fly off to Afghanistan, you fight the Taliban, and then you forget to build the pipeline? I mean, is that how the story goes? And this sounds preposterous, but it is representative of the various preposterous inferences that are made by the conspiracy theorists I've been studying over the last 3 years. All I can say is that makes a great final exhibit for the points I've been making. I'll stop there.
Well, and what I would say is I agree. There is no pipeline yet. The accusations of we're going back for a second time wasn't brought up. Once again, it seems to be a bit of a confirmation bias more than looking at the facts as they were at the time. But, in closing, what I would say is if people do have questions about this, ask, do some research. Don't just jump to the first conclusion, regardless of what it is. That's why we have things like the 9/11 report to look into to help people understand what happened.
Okay, up next is Kevin and Todd for 2 minutes.
Okay, if you don't mind, Todd, I'll just say for a minute or so that, for myself and most of the people I know, we're not conspiracy theorists. We don't actually want a new outrageous conspiracy theory. We've already got one of those. We know it's false, and we've gone a long way down a path of war based on this obviously, provably false conspiracy theory. So what we would like is not even really a new investigation. We want an actual investigation, into what happened, and typically, done by investigators who would ask who benefits from the crime. But if people have time, there is a 9/11 family member effort right now going on at rememberbuilding7.org. If you just read the 9/11 Commission report, you can't remember Building 7 because they didn't mention it, but rememberbuilding7.org is a great way to get people to get the information out. I'd also always suggest the film 9/11 Press for Truth. So please see that film, 9/11 Press for Truth, to hear the story of how that investigation started.
And I would like to recommend that if people are interested in the question of the veracity of the 9/11 Commission report, that they read a fine book by David Ray Griffin called 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions. And I would also recommend a new website, consensus911.org. This is a panel of people who have looked at evidence using a very sophisticated method and have come up with 94% agreement on the strength of 13 points that people should consider. It's consensus911.org. I'm a member of the panel, and my contact information is available there. Thank you very much.